For a very informative presentation. We'll move quickly on to the second speaker, Nicola Cantore. Nicola is an ODI Research Fellow within the International Economic Development Group. During his doctoral studies, he had the opportunity to investigate issues concerning climate change economics and emissions mitigation policies. So the floor is yours.
Yes. The results that we're presenting now about this paper come from a paper that we wrote with Jessica, one of our colleagues here. And we try to play a bit with numbers in order to understand what are the numbers behind additionality, and what are the current funds available for countries, and what are the adaptation needs for developing countries, in particular for Africa. I think that there are, as outlined by the recent European Commission blueprint, there are 3 different channels for climate finance: international public finance, private capital flows, and domestic climate finance. We know that in many developing countries, domestic climate finance is quite difficult, as there are problems of access to credits, there is lack of capital. In terms of capital flows, there was, until Copenhagen, still now, huge debates for which policy can stimulate international capital flows, private international capital flows. One of the most debated, the emission trading schemes. And we know what are difficult behind the emission trading schemes. We know that a trading scheme needs also specific caps for the developing countries, but there are equity problems behind caps to the developing countries. We know that to implement emission trading schemes, we need to create an artificial market. And so we need to set caps in order so that supply and demand of emissions permits can determine a price that is not too much low or too much high. International public finance, so in this context, has a very important role. And in particular, in this paper, we try to compare what are the adaptation needs, the adaptation costs for developing countries, and what are the numbers in terms of official development assistance funds. Before presenting the numbers, I think that we should introduce briefly the notion of additionality. Here we report 4 definitions that we take from an OECD document in 2008. And broadly, we can define the 4 definitions of additionality. The first definition requires a complete separation between official development assistance and additional funds for climate finance. Another definition of additionality requires a partial overlapping between ODA and climate finance. This is quite consistent with what Gordon Brown proposed before the Copenhagen negotiations. He claimed that just 10% of ODA could be diverted from official development assistance to climate finance. Another definition of additionality calls for a complete overlapping between ODA and the climate finance. And the final definition requires a complete overlapping between ODA and climate finance, but requires also additional funds for overlapping if compared to those that are set just for Millennium Development Goals. If you look carefully at those definitions of additionality, we can see that in the first 2 definitions of additionalities, there is a stress over the fact that we need separation between climate finance channels and the ODA channels in order to avoid diversion from Millennium Development Goals to climate finance goals. And another distinction that is very important we can find from these definitions of additionality is that whereas the first, second, and fourth definition of additionalities, there is just a call for, there is an emphasis on the volume of finance that is needed. So it's important to have additional funds in terms of volume for climate finance. In the third definitions, definition, there is an operational definition of additionality. So it's important just to have actions on climate change without thinking about the effects they're having from diversions. Now we'll present some results. We try to play with numbers. We will present some results coming from some very rough estimations of official development assistance funds for developing countries according to different scenarios. That one thing that we present now. And the second, what will be the consequences for developing countries if all ODA funds were diverted, if some or all the ODA funds were diverted from Millennium Development Goals to climate finance goals. We just, as first step, assume 4 scenarios. One, business as usual scenario. We just assume that by 2030, DAC countries use 0.7 of gross national income for international aid. We call this scenario baseline scenarios, but it's hard to define these baseline scenarios because we know that there are difficulties for rich countries to respect their pledge in terms of finance for development to developing countries. In the 8.1, 8.2 scenarios, we assume that by 2030, the rich country respect their 0.7 pledge, and plus they use, in the 8.1 scenarios, an additional 0.5% of GNI is used for climate finance. And in the 8.2 scenarios, we assume that beyond the funds that are used for official development assistance, 67 billion per year are used for climate finance to developing countries. The 0.5 proposal was proposed by many emerging countries and developing countries. In our paper, we reviewed 26 proposals for developing countries. Half of these proposals were required, called for these 0.5 additional funds for climate finance. The 67 billion additional funds were proposed by the Africa group. In the diverse scenarios, we assume that the 0.7 target is respected by rich countries toward developing countries in terms of ODA, but 67 billion per year are diverted from ODA traditional goals to climate finance. What is interesting in this figure, I think, is that, of course, it's quite intuitive. More are funds devoted to developing countries for climate and development goals, and we see that the more is the amounts of funds available for developing countries. So the scenarios divert in which there is a diversion of funds from Millennium Development Goals to climate finance goals is the scenario where there is the lower amounts of funds for developing countries. The highest amount is Aid 1, in which there is a rich country respected 0.7 target, and plus they devoted 0.5 of GNI to developing countries. What is interesting in this graph is the magnitude of the difference between the diversion scenario and the Aid 1 scenarios. As you can see, by 2030, there is a gap between the Aid 1 scenarios and the diverse scenarios of around 400 billions per year. Another experiment, another exercise that we try to do is to compare current share of regional share of official development systems. Data comes from the OECD data about aid. And the adaptation needs geographical shares according to World Bank estimations. What is interesting from this table is that there is not a match between the current geographical ODA spending and the adaptation needs for developing countries. As you can see from this table, for example, the adaptation needs for developing countries represent just 22% of total adaptation needs for all developing countries. But the current spending in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of aid represent 38%. This means that if all ODA spending were used to cover adaptation needs, we could we could generate a diversion of funds from regions from sub-Saharan Africa to other regions, for example, like Latin America and Caribbean or Asia. Not only, as you can see from this graph, we try also to compare the current ODA spending in terms of sectors with the adaptation costs that are needed for each sector. Also, in this case, we can see that if ODA spending were used for climate finance purpose, and in particular for adaptation needs, we could generate a diversion of funds. And in particular, a diversion of funds, for example, from human health, that currently has a high share of ODA funds, to other sectors like water supply or ecosystem protection. So if ODA were used for adaptation needs, we had a diversion of geographical diversion of funds and a sectoral diversion of funds. What are the consequences for developing countries? Of course, additional climate finance for the developing countries means large additional volumes and means also scaling up in terms of regions, of funds, in terms of regions, in terms of sectors. But if there is a diversion of ODA funds towards developing countries, so not additional, but diversion, the consequence will be not a scaling up, but a cut of funding for certain sectors and a cut of funding for certain regions, in particular Africa, that, as we see, is very, very vulnerable in terms of development, in terms of climate change impacts. However, the impact of additional climate finance could also generate some negative consequences. Dutch disease or crowding out effects, for example. So European countries, there are massive investments for abroad, massive aid that can be more lazy, for example, in terms of domestic investments. Maybe Guido can tell more later about the Dutch disease effects that can derive from aid. In terms of the donor's perspective, probably it's also important, not only volume of finance. The volume of finance is important for developing countries, but also the channel for finance. Our subjective interpretation, then we can discuss later during the open floor discussion, is that if there is the same mechanism in order to for development and climate finance, if there are the same mechanisms, probably there is a problem of difficulties to measure additionalities. But of course, there is more strong coordination. So if climate finance is separate for development finance, probably it's more easy to measure additionality. But probably there is a problem of transaction cost and fragmentation in the aid. Some problems can arrive also from private channels because, of course, there is a problem if there was an emission trade schemes, a problem of price uncertainty of the price of permits. And, of course, probably another problem will be that funds will be diverted towards those countries where business opportunities in green sector would be more promising. And probably there will be also problem of coordination, as the uncertainty of price of permits, coordination between the private and public funding, especially in relation to an overall goal of overall goal for aid in general. The conclusion is that probably from our numbers, from our estimations, current ODA spending may not cover future adaptation needs. This seems to derive from our experiment. And second, if current ODA spending level is used to cover adaptation needs, there is a concrete risk of geographical and sectoral funds diversion. So I think that at this moment we have to think about innovative tools for financing other than beyond ODA. For example, we should think, for example, also about the UNFCCC mechanisms, the Adaptation Fund, the JEF Fund. We have to think that the ODA probably in terms of climate finance, it is very important to build adaptive capacity. The ONFCCC, China's mechanism are more important probably to compensate developing countries for climate change damages. So there is a different philosophy between the two sources of funding. But probably Jessica will tell more about, in her presentation, about source of funding that can be useful beyond the official development systems to cover adaptation needs.
Thank you very much, Nicola.